everyone. So I have 20 minutes, so we're going to jump right into it. So obviously, we live in the aftermath of an incredible technological innovation and breakthrough, one that's changed 100 years of how we've thought, changes the next 100 years, and when it happened, completely changed the rules of the game, made us question a lot of things. Specifically, will craft exist? It ended a lot of legacies, caused a lot of people to wonder what's going to be next. And obviously, I'm talking about the launch of the Seiko Astron watch in 1969. And so our story today is going to begin here, Act 1. So to understand why this was such an incredible breakthrough, you first have to understand a little bit about the watch industry and the history of it. So when you pull off all the finish and all the polish and all the beautiful things associated with a watch, this is what's behind it. It's a bunch of gears. Watchmaking, particularly clockmaking, has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. And there's incredible legacy, incredible craft dedicated to the mastery of the architecture, the precision, refinement of these gears so that the hour hand moves precisely, the minute hand moves precisely. And in fact, when you talk to people pre-1969 in terms of what made a luxury watch, it first began with a conversation about mechanical accuracy. Now, accuracy was incredibly important because making a watch, particularly a wristwatch, let alone a clock, was really difficult to get all of these gears packed together in this really tiny space. And what would end up happening for less perfectly made watches is they'd be off by a few seconds each day, each week. Maybe at the end of the month, you might have added 5 seconds, lost 5 seconds. So that's why when you go back and you watch people wind or play with mechanical watches, that's what they're doing. They're recalibrating the time. So the pinnacle of engineering, craftsmanship, and mastery was around how accurate could you get the mechanical watch to work. At the same time, it wasn't just about the engineering behind the dial. It was also about the component craftsmanship. What was the finish? What was the polish associated with the watch? So when you look at a Patek, you get this really beautiful, elegant composition that hides this incredible complexity behind it. So in 1969, when the Astron came out, that all changed. Seiko, who was in Japan, launched this product, and it was a jaw-dropper in the industry. Because what ended up happening with it was it took an industry that had been focused on mechanical accuracy and polish and finishing and aesthetics and said, this is how watches are going to be made from now on. And so this is the circuit board of that Seiko watch. And what made this so profound was not so much the circuit board, but this little tiny thing right here. So this is called a quartz crystal oscillator. So this was what was the revolution in watchmaking, that little thing right there. Because what it did is it turned watches from mechanical pieces of technology into digital pieces of technology. And the oscillator was the way that it happened. And so when they launched it, it was a whole conversation about accuracy. These are the most accurate watches in the world. And it wasn't just a superficial thing that they were charging after of like, okay, you don't have to wind it or rewind it every few days or every few weeks or so. Accuracy mattered. It mattered to scientists, it mattered to astronomers, it mattered to all pilots, it mattered to all sorts of people. So accuracy was incredibly important to the watch industry. And just to give you a sense of how precise and how consistent the accuracy was, the mechanical watches like the Patek I showed you earlier, like I said, gained or lost about 5 seconds over the course of a month. A Seiko Astron would lose 1 second of precision time over the course of 1,000 years. So this was a major breakthrough in one of the most important pieces of technology in human history. And so what you get is this dichotomy between luxury watches that looked like this and the Seiko Astron, which also looked like that. And so, but the important thing was, kind of how I said at the start of the game, this rewrote the rules and how the watch industry worked. Because the old game was all about, like I said, mechanical accuracy, component craft. But so too was the new game, except it was digital accuracy. It was much more precise and consistent, but it was also radically affordable, like 80% on a discount on what you would buy a Patek for pre-1969. And so when accuracy was the most important thing, and you could get the same finish and polish as a Patek, but at 20% the price, this is what happened to the industry. You went from Swiss watchmakers being about, what do I say here, about 1,600 different companies pre-1969. And by 1983, there were about 600. This was a massive disruption in the truest sense of the term. Clayton Christensen's term of disruption is when a innovation at the lower end of the market performs better than the best at the top end of the market. It inverts and completely rearranges the industry. And that's exactly what happened in the watch industry. So it left everyone scrambling. No one knew what to do, how to compete, even what was valuable. And glad the typography's right. So in terms of this, the Swiss watchmakers had to confront an existential threat to their existence. They were not, it was not just a conceptual thing, they were feeling it economically as one watchmaker after the other shut down. And so what they struggled to do is they failed to defend why mechanical watches were valuable in this new quartz era. And so that brings us to our second. Let's jump ahead. So obviously you know some of the parallels that I'm alluding to here. Massive technological innovation that's completely rethinking our industry, changing the way we think and everything. And of course, there are a lot of alarm bells going off. Yale University did a whole study on this, basically concluded, let's be very clear. Gen AI is here to displace artists. It is what it is designed to do. The World Economic Forum said basically the same thing. Graphic design is one of the most at-risk jobs in this new era. This conference that I was at was a closed-door conference among, it wasn't even really a conference, it was just a conversation among all the leading design executives in all these major corporations. And it was the question, is design dead? This is existential in the same way that the Swiss suffered an existential threat. Now, Scott Galloway has even gone so far to say the era of brand is dead. It's not just about design. All of brand is dead. Now, obviously, a lot of this stuff is for headlines. A lot of this stuff can be hyperbole. But the reality is these are things that we really have to wrestle with because this isn't just philosophical. There are real economic implications happening because of the advancement of technology in our space. So I've been doing this for 20 years. And in that period of time, I've written a lot of scopes. And I have seen a lot of RFPs come in, and I know the price tag that is associated with the work that we do. And the reality is that over that period of time, the price is pretty consistent in terms of real dollars, and I'm talking about US dollars. 300K, 600K, 50K, whatever the asset is, whatever the thing that the client wants to make, it's more or less been priced within the same real US dollars. But the reality is you might say, okay, that's fine. But when you look at inflation and you look at the buying power of the US dollar, and this is really true of many countries, whatever your currency is, it goes down. So the fact that the dollar amount, the currency amount stays the same year over year is not a good thing. It is a bad thing. It means that what we are doing is being priced at a lower and lower value, even though it doesn't feel like it. And here's some real data that was given to me by a person I know who was out looking for several different design firms to work with them. And they were really struggling to figure out how to vet these different agencies because they went through, this many agencies, I didn't count it prior to this. Here's the spread for the same scope of work. That's crazy. This is absolutely crazy that you could have a 17x variance in scope submitted for the exact, or a proposal submitted for the exact same scope of work. And even if you take the median, that's still about a 4.6, 5x difference between the two. You know which one they went with? After they were talking to me like, which one should we go with? How do we pull them apart? How do we understand the difference? They went with that one. It's insulting. But they didn't see a reason to pay more. They figured these were all tier 1 design firms. You know, in many people's eyes, they are. So what was the difference? Why would I pay more? Well, this is a quote from LinkedIn that I showed last year, but I think it is very important to note. This is the reality that we are living with. Clients see what we do as cheap. Just make stuff real quick. If it doesn't work, we'll throw it in the trash. That's why that previous client paid so little. Why is that? Well, in pure economic terms, it's because the cost of entry of starting a firm is near zero. All you need is a laptop. Everything else has been turned into software that you can just use. The quality is amazing. Everybody's making incredible work. And it's hard to tell the difference between everyone. And then finally, there's a lot of people entering the space, a lot of people breaking out from big agencies, a lot of people entering because it's so much easier now. But the reality is this is all tech-driven. And it's not just AI. All sorts of technology is driving this erosion of value in what we do. AI is just going to supercharge every single one of those. So I can't help but think about what Patek was feeling when the quartz oscillator came out. Because in many ways, I see a lot of relevance between luxury watchmaking and brand identity design. And I don't mean to pick on Target, but it's a round logo, so it helped me with my overall gestalt. But Target is a placeholder for all brands, all brand design. Because much like luxury watches, both are heritage-driven. Both are mechanical in nature. How do we take pieces and put them together into a working system? Both value expertise shown in the system elegance of how we piece everything together. We index on artistic styling for distinction. We seek emotional or symbolic value, and we are both facing technological disruption. Now, obviously, we're not facing a circuit board. We're facing something much different. But the reality is that if we look back at what the Swiss watchmakers did at the time, we can learn something. Because at the time, Swiss watches had to reinvent themselves around what you could not reduce to a circuit board. And if anyone in here is a luxury watch aficionado, you might know where I'm going with this, because there's this idea of complications within luxury watches. So a complication is anything that is added to a watch that allows it to do something beyond telling time, which is the base functionality of a watch. So if we look at, complications have been around for a long time. This wasn't something invented in 1969. So this is a British officer's World War I wristwatch that they would wear in the trench to help coordinate artillery firing. And that little case, that little shell on it is actually a shrapnel protection. Because coordinating movements on the battlefield were incredibly important vantage. Pilots need complications in order to understand different time zones and manage that. Omega invented a waterproof watch in 1932, had that casing over it. And so these are all complications. They can either be components, logic of function, or performance ability. In any case, each one allows the watch to do something beyond telling time. So what happened in 1969 is the luxury watch manufacturers said, oh God, we got to do something that you can't reduce to a circuit board. And so what they leaned into were complications. Complications were special. Complications were interesting. Complications showed mastery. And they had value to the wearer. And so what they did was they leaned into it and went from watches that looked like this to a Patek, which looks like this. They removed the simplicity to reveal the system underneath. Or the Vacheron would look like this, again, similar to the Patek, now looks like this, which shows 7 complications on its dial. So what you have is this big transition from an industry that focused on component craft as a distinction to one that focuses on complication as the source of value and distinction. Now, complications are really interesting because there's so many different kinds of complications. I won't go into all of them because of time, but just one of them to talk about is a chronograph. Even though there are different categorical complications, there's also, within each category, different kinds of subcategories of complications. So there's this whole world of innovation and value that's being created in complications. And in fact, Vacheron, I think it was last year, actually launched the most complicated watch in history with 41 complications. Now, what's amazing is, even though the luxury watch industry had a come to Jesus moment where it's like, oh my God, our industry is collapsing, by moving into complications, they actually emerged as a stronger industry than they were before. So if we look at data from Rolex, we see some really amazing stuff. This is a trend line of the mean price point for a Rolex since 1960s. This is, sorry, the median, and this is the mean. You can see it went up in price. On a per unit basis, it was more valued because they focused on complications. That's a 10x increase. And if you look at the average MSRP value, and by the way, these are all inflation-adjusted price points, you can see all the way here at the bottom in 2012, which is the one I have the most data for, you can start to see a drift towards the right side of that. So they were able to charge more per complication. So when we think about this shift to complications, I think there's something really valuable for us to take away from here. Because when we look at this, we can think of this as a parallel between our pre-AI industry and our post-AI industry. And that brings us to the third part of our storytelling, which it looks like I'm going to be right on time. So going back to this, we have to accept that there is a pre-AI world of what we do in a post-AI world. We can't just stick our heads in the sand and say we're going to keep doing what we're doing. It's fundamentally different. We have to recognize that. And we have to respond. Now, in the pre-AI world, this is really the breakdown of what happens. You know, we'd value a concept, we'd apply aesthetic to it, we'd get on stage like this, show it off to each other, we'd all golf clap, and we go home. But the reality is that that can't be the case anymore. We shouldn't ignore those things, but we have to recognize that there is a performance aspect to what we do, that if we lean into it, will make what we do more valuable and our industry more successful. So, like today's luxury watches, the value of tomorrow's identity systems won't be found in its form. It'll be found in how the system performs. Now, this is different than forms follow function. Function is what a hammer does. It hits things, does the same thing over and over again. Performance is about fluidity, dynamism, being context dependent. It is a more dynamic form of functionality than just doing the same thing over and over again. And this isn't a crazy idea. This is rooted in the history of design. So this is our buddy Joseph, who very famously created these posters and wrote this book called The Grid System. Now, Joseph Mueller-Brockman didn't do this because he wanted to help identity systems identify better. He did it for efficiency. He wanted to make sure that whoever implemented the system could do it in a fast, logical way. That is not expression. That is operational. And this has become a seminal part of our industry. Now, there's so many different things that design does beyond just signal, beyond just express. Those are two subsets. But I don't think we're getting credit for this because we focus so much on concept and aesthetic. And so the problem isn't that design is becoming less valuable, it's that we lack language to describe what makes design so valuable. So the client's definition of value defaults to aesthetics. We need a new vocabulary of performance. And so when we go back to this watch and the idea of complications, I think we have a path forward. But we can't call it complications, because that makes it sound like we're making it harder to work with the systems. So at Collins, what we've been working with and developing and proposing is this idea of augments, extending the capability and performance features of identity systems. So what is an augment? Very similar to a complication. It is an added capability to an identity system that goes beyond the core functioning of identity, and it can be found in these three forms. Over the years, we have developed different augments to give language to the things that we've done, that you guys have done, that the whole industry has been doing for a long time, but we never got credit for because we didn't name it. We didn't surface it to the client to reveal that value. And so and I'm over time now, but this will be really quick. And a few examples of this would be a sandbox. So a sandbox is a fixed container component that enables open-ended expression within a fixed boundary. It's ideal for co-branding, collaborations, co-creation, and temporal campaigns. So we did this for the Girl Scouts, and many of you have done this too. Girl Scouts have been around a long time, been distracted by making cookies, had to get back to a reality where they weren't just about selling cookies, but they were about helping young girls find anything that they got excited about and learn together. So we went back to the trefoil symbol that had been used over time, and what we did was we distilled it down to its essence, and as part of the whole identity system, we created a sandbox for infinite expression that still rooted the fundamental gestalt in the Girl Scouts. The next one would be a 3P IP adapter. Many of you work with companies where you have to figure out how to integrate inconsistent, highly variant third-party content in with the brand system that you're working with. That's what this does. So this is true of publishers, of multi-brand retailers, of community-based brands. And there's a lot of different ways of doing this. One is what we did for YouTube, where you create a frame around the content that's iconic. You do it with a distinctive crop. I have to go through these a little quickly. You do it through a lens, which shows you different colorways. We did this for Spotify. You do what we did for Sequoia Capital, where you do an overlay on top of that to do narrative storytelling, or you establish really explicit taste logic, like shot on the iPhone campaign. And so much like the chronograph, these are different ways of doing it. Color graph, I'll go through these quickly. This governs how color is used and how an experience is organized around color to enhance navigability and understanding. If any of you have ever been into a Target, you know everything is red, no matter where you walk. We used to say it's red, white, and scream. Everything is red. And so what we had to do was we had to introduce new colors to help define the spaces so that you could phrase the parts of the experience and use color as a category cue to help people understand where they went. This is the color graph that we put together for Target to do that, and they implemented. And then finally, I think this is the final one, grid, which we all know, is a structural system enforcing that consistency just the way Brockman did. We don't have to invent stuff. This is stuff that we can pull forward from the past. And very similar to the chronograph, there's a whole different range of grids that we can build. The most famous being the one our boy Massimo created years ago for the National Park Service that became iconic within itself. But that in of itself is a complication because it establishes the underlying logic of how everything works. So in wrapping up, what is the value of design? Well, the reality is that all value is perceived value. And I do mean all. It doesn't matter that AI is here. It doesn't matter that it's going to disrupt and change the rules of everything. What matters is how we respond. And like those Swiss watchmakers, the value that we have is already here. We just have to surface it. We have to make it understandable with language. And I think the best way that I can leave you is just this quote from Wittgenstein with a slight modification to it. Because the limits of my language mean the limits of my value. And so I encourage all of us to find new language to express the performance features of what we do, because that is what's going to matter going forward. When aesthetics become cheap, when iteration becomes so fast that clients don't know where to place the value anymore. We have to maintain aesthetics, we have to maintain concept, but we have to introduce the idea of performance, which we've always done before, but it's now time for us to get credit for it. Thank you.